from the City of Presidents. It's the All About QuinZEE podcast. This is your host, John Melley. Join me as we explore the history, hidden gems, and highlight the businesses with great stories that all tell the tale why QuinZEE, Massachusetts is a great place to live.
It's John. How are you? Thanks for spending time with me today. I appreciate it. Welcome back to the podcast. Just by way of an update, we have had 4,515 downloads of the various odd and sundry episodes of the All About QuinZEE podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for sharing this podcast with your friends and neighbors in QuinZEE, Massachusetts, maybe even with some folks who used to live in QuinZEE but no longer, but feel a strong attachment to their hometown, their home city, the City of Presidents. Well, we have a returning guest today, Patrick Grimes, and he's got another story to share with us from his anthology, Growing Up QuinZEE. I just want to thank everybody who's been signing up for our free newsletter email list. If you would like to get, every week, we send out a short little newsletter that has a handful of events that are taking place in QuinZEE or in the surrounding area. Most of the events are free. A few of them are paid. A lot of them are from folks who have been guests on the All About QuinZEE podcast. We like to throw our support behind the folks who have supported this podcast. If you would like to get on that list, just go to allaboutquinzeepodcast.com and there will be one of those pop-ups. Sometimes I find them annoying, but this is a really good one. I know I'm biased, but at any rate, if you'd like to get on that free email newsletter list, just go to allaboutquinzeepodcast.com and you'll probably see something that says sign up for a free e-newsletter. It goes out every Wednesday or Thursday, depending on how busy Wednesday is. If you have an event coming up that you would like promoted and included in that newsletter, please feel free to share it with us. You can either drop us a line at john@allaboutquinzeepodcast.com. That's our email address. You can go to our contact page at allaboutquinzeepodcast.com, or you can even follow us on Instagram and just search for All About QuinZEE podcast on Instagram. And if you have an event, you can tag us. We've had several people do that. Just tag us in the Instagram and I throw it in the newsletter. So do that. We've got over 560 followers on Instagram, so we're developing quite a following there. The podcast is sponsored by throwmydogabone.com, and Throw My Dog a Bone, it's a way for you to support the podcast because there are costs associated with running this show. I've got two platforms I host. I host the website on with all the images and text and all that kind of stuff. But the audio, we have so many downloads happening at once that if I hosted the audio on the same server as the website, it would crash the website. I have to use a separate server where the audio alone is hosted, and it's a special server that allows multiple people to call for the podcast and stream the podcast at the same time, and it won't crash my server. It won't crash other people's websites that are on the same server as mine is, because you get a lot of nasty emails when that happens. They say, hey. Yeah, so I've remedied that situation, and I use a host for the audio, and so it costs money. If you're willing to throwmydogabone.com, what that is you can go to throwmydogabone.com and buy digital dog bones. They're not real dog bones. It's a metaphor. But basically, they're $5 each. You can buy 1, 2, 5, 10. We've even had people buy 20 digital dog bones to support the podcast. Now, here's what's going to happen when you do that. 20% of all the donations after banking charges, everybody's got their finger in your pie. 20% after all those little finance charges, that's going to go to the Forever Home New England Dog Rescue. That's where we got our Trudy. Trudy is a rescue. We're her third family, and someday I may tell you that whole story. But she is definitely part of the pack here. She is very comfortable at home, and we just love her. It's been amazing to watch her open up and relax. She's been with us just over 2 years now, and we never really saw her. A lot of people say personality, but she's not a person, she's a dog. So I like to call that a doganality, if you will. We never really saw her true doganality until maybe 8-9 months in her stay with us. And then once she realized that this was home, boy, she's really just blossomed. She's a sweetheart. She's a protector. She's a fierce protector of the homestead and of my wife. She's very bonded with Ann. But she is a cuddle bug. She's like a little lapdog. She thinks she's a little lapdog, but she's not. She's a big girl. But anyway, we love her. So 20% after banking charges is going to go to the Forever Home New England Dog Rescue. And then the remaining 80% is going to go to support this podcast. So if you want to help support and give dogs loving homes and support this podcast, just go to throwmydogabone.com and buy 1, 5, 10, 20 digital dog bones. I think I got that all straightened out. So thank you for doing that, if you will. So now let's get to my conversation with our returning guest, Patrick Grimes, the author of Growing Up QuinZEE. Well, welcome back. My returning guest is none other than Patrick Grimes, who's the author of Growing Up QuinZEE. And Patrick, thanks for coming back to the All About QuinZEE podcast.
It's always fun to talk with you, John. And of course, it's always fun to share stories of growing up in QuinZEE when I was young.
Yeah, we took a bit of a break. I hope you had a good holiday season and that your winter is going well. We were chatting about you in one of the episodes of the podcast where we interviewed Next Chapter Books and More with Helena Skinner. And I guess they're carrying your book in their shop. And they had nothing but great things to say about you and your generosity and your book.
She's great. I think it's wonderful that maybe bookstores are coming back, because I think that's a place that the more we meet as people and talk, I think, especially today, not on social media, but just to talk person to person, I think the better we all are.
I agree with you. And I think a lot of other people do, because that's why your stories, they generate so much, and people identify with the stories, but also I think with the overall message and theme of our episodes, we've talked about what you just said a number of times about the need for personal contact and one-to-one communication. I think another thing that does that, and I'm not shy about promoting it, is dogs, having dogs and walking around. And I know I've met people from very different backgrounds from mine, but we all have this common love of dogs, and we can certainly agree on that.
That might be a great way for us to get together, right? If people just start talking and showing up with their dogs, and we start talking again and we start communicating again, I think would be a wonderful thing.
And your stories do a similar thing in that there's so much in them that so many people can identify with. Maybe not that they were there at the time and place of the story that you're writing about, but they have something similar in their lives that they can reflect back on.
Absolutely. And I think my story today is...
what are we going to hear?
You know what? The yard, as we called it, was a shipyard. It was the center of everything QuinZEE. Everyone knew someone who worked there. And I'm sure there are thousands and thousands of stories about different things that happened at the yard. So, of course, when I was writing my book, I figured I need to share a story about my summer, just one summer, I'll give you a hint, at the yard.
Okay. I had a granduncle who worked at the yard, and Ann had relatives who worked at the shipyard as well. All right. Well, without any more hesitation or preambles, let's let you dive in and tell you your story. Here's Patrick Grimes with a story from his book, Growing Up QuinZEE. It's called The Yard.
The yard. It was given many names over the years, since it originally moved to QuinZEE in 1901. Bethlehem Shipyard, Four River Shipyard, and beginning in 1964, General Dynamics. Most of the people I knew simply called it the yard. Actually, most people around there possessed a Boston area bred genetic linguistic gene, so it's really the yard. But for purposes of this story, I'll opt to try and include that elusive R. If someone lived in QuinZEE, Massachusetts, then it was a good bet you knew a lot of people that worked at the yard. and probably a few of them were part of your own family. My dad did. And in the summer of 1969, I would become very familiar with a ship, a unique culture, and the manner of men who labored there. Some people know what they would really like to do with their lives at an early age. Not me. I was not one of them. In the summer of 1969, after graduating from QuinZEE High School, I had no idea how to answer a simple question posed by my father. It was a question most men, young men, dread, especially if coming from their father. So, what are you going to do? The first thing that entered my mind is probably not a good answer. Not go to school anymore? Knowing better than giving that answer, I settled on a more typical retort. I don't know. My father had a ready solution and suggested that I work the summer at the shipyard. Don't get me wrong, I loved my dad and knew he worked hard as a shipyard head rigger. But being aware of a lot of stories from people who had worked there, the idea of spending a summer in the bowels of some half-built ship wasn't high on my list of options. As with most things that come from your dad, his idea was more of a directive, disguised as a suggestion. And so began my summer's memorable journey at the yard. The first day I reported for work, I was met by a nice guy at the gate. He was wearing a white hard hat, which I came to know meant he was a supervisor or manager. Shaking my hand, he told me his name and explained that he was a friend of my father and my new boss. Escorting me through the gate, I stepped into a world I was only aware of, looking at it from the outside, from the many vantage points around QuinZEE. The shipyard was a main landmark of the city. Sure, we were also the city of presidents and housed the birthplaces of John Adams and John Quincy Adams, along with a host of other historical landmarks, and our famous quarries were dotted throughout. But the essence of our city was a shipyard, which provided jobs and sustenance for many of the men and the families who lived there. If giving directions to friends, it was also the familiar marker that was used. Turn left at the yard, or go past the yard, were part of the usual directives for those trying to navigate through that part of the city. If a stranger needed simple directions, most of us used shipyard in lieu of yard. Simple enough. It also served as a backdrop, especially for those traveling over the Fore River Bridge. Tall crane, docks, and partially built ships loomed below, and strange sounds emanated and echoed from the tools of the men working there. For those of us who never passed through the gates, the shipyard stood somewhat ominous and seemed to hold its own special kind of mystery. I was led by my new boss into a building where new employees were processed and given their necessities. Wearing a short-sleeved shirt on a hot summer's day inside a ship seemed appropriate to me, but as I would soon find out, was not recommended. It would be the last day I wore one. A badge, hard hat, safety glasses, and work gloves were handed to me. Then I was given a fairly large toolbox and a few assorted tools, which I placed inside. Not being a very mechanical guy, I thought it was kind of cool having my own work tools. My new boss's name was Jim, and he was a work friend of my father. He seemed a rather jovial sort and a pretty neat guy. So at this point, I felt at ease and excited to start my new job. That feeling would be short-lived. When Jim motioned me to follow him, still happy and naive, I quickly complied. He held one end of my toolbox and I the other, and together we headed toward one of those half-built ships. Maneuvering around all kinds of unfamiliar contraptions we stepped onto the deck. I immediately noticed nothing was built on top of the main deck. All work was being performed below. Finally, we arrived at a good-sized hole and stopped. There was a ladder secured to the hole's side, leading down to whatever lay below. Peeking down, I could see a dim light, sparks, and heard all kinds of strange noises. I immediately looked at Jim. He gave me a reassuring smile, and my first instruction, Pat, put on your safety glasses. And as we go down the ladder, don't look directly at the flash from the torches of the welders. You could get flash burn, which could permanently damage your eyes. I remember a small alarm going off in my head, but quickly shook it off. As he proceeded down the ladder, holding up my toolbox, I followed him, holding onto the other end. Balancing the weight of the toolbox with one hand while making my way down a ladder was an art I hadn't mastered, but apparently Jim had. He could see I was struggling and shouldered most of the burden. Rather quickly, the weight and clumsiness of the toolbox lost its importance. I had descended into a new world, strange and uncanny. The deck below us was dimly lit, and flashes from welders' torches surrounded me. The only place I could safely look was straight down. All around me were echoing, scraping, and banging noises, mixed with incoherent human voices. In the corner of my eye, I spotted helmeted bodies strewn about in various positions, performing their tasks. Some were standing, some kneeling, some perched on scaffolding or ladders. Meanwhile, Jim, probably noticing my widening eyes and my shocked look, put his arm around me and began yelling something. Yet amid all the noise and commotion, it sounded barely above a whisper. There were two tools I later came to recognize well, chippers and sandblasters. Both tools were used for metal surface preparation to clean or rid them of grime or rust, used before painting or applying other needed applications. There were many different kinds, but one thing they all had in common was the ear-piercing sounds they emitted. In the bowels of a ship, their clamor was literally deafening. I quickly developed a deep-seated hatred of those two tools as Jim and I were standing on the lower deck, trying to understand one another, surrounded by all the amplified clamor and noise usually found in the bowels of a ship. As if on cue, the chippers and sandblasters began to chime in with all the other cacophony of sounds. My strange world, somehow in some way, became even stranger. All at once, all other sound was lost. Jim was standing within inches of my face and was screaming some direction at me. I couldn't hear him. Not able to hear his voice, I screamed back that I couldn't hear him, and he smiled and pointed to the hole, indicating that he wanted us to descend the ladder deeper into the ship. That was the point when three things became clear to me. One, shipyard workers had seemingly developed a special and unique ability to read lips. Two, shipyard workers were not sane. Three, I had no further intention of becoming one of them, even for a summer. By the time I possessed these three new revelations, Jim had secured my toolbox to a rope and was lowering it to the next deck. Only I had no intention of going there. Still unable to hear, and with sparks flying about me, I screamed at the top of my lungs 2 words: I quit. A perplexed look came over Jim's face. He put his hand to his ear and mouthed, "What?" I repeated my proclamation, and a new look took over Jim's face. Only this time, it was his eyes that widened. I later came to understand his look and his quandary. How was he going to tell my father his son quit before he even started? Frankly, at this point, I didn't care. I just wanted out. Jim put both of his hands on my shoulders and with a pleading look waved me toward the hole. Reluctantly, I went and laddered down 2 more decks to the bottom of the ship. A different world exists on the lowest deck of a ship still under construction. Here, there is better lighting, and all the noise, welding flashes, sparks, and racket either disappeared or were muffled. I could actually hear and speak in a normal voice. Jim quickly explained this was where I would work. Looking around, seeing the smiley faces of my new co-workers, I nodded my head. My summer at the shipyard began. Jim and I both agreed and promised to never speak about that first half hour inside the ship to my father. No problem on my end. We humans have an amazing ability to adapt to our surroundings, and I too eventually became inured to the crazy happenings and environment inside a budding ship. My team, a hardened group of veterans of shipyard life, welcomed me and eventually mentored me to the ways and customs of shipyard life. One of the more usual traditions was called the extra break. And unbeknownst to management, every team member was expected to participate. Basically, an extra 30 minutes or so was extended to each person to take an unofficial and undocumented break in a place of their choosing. Of course, the managers and supervisors were unaware of these, and much effort and planning was done to ensure it remained that way. I quickly learned there were 2 safe places to hide while resting. One was inside an air conditioning vent where a man would squiggle and crawl through its narrow passageway to a waiting pillow and vent opening. There he would rest, and when his time was up, someone below would tap on the vent. He'd squiggle out, and the next man would squiggle in. The second was a trip to the infamous shipyard bathroom stalls, where a man could lock the door and sit on the stool for his allotted rest time. Apparently, many of the shipyard workers enjoyed this particular venue, and the walls of each bathroom stall were decorated with all types of wit and meanderings from previous inhabitants. If able to withstand the odor alternating between the many commodes, one could easily spend their extra rest time trying to read and decipher the hieroglyphics contained within. I swiftly opted for the air conditioning vent. Being the low man on the sorority totem pole meant sometimes new tasks were assigned to you, or rather volunteered. Not all of them were much fun. One in particular was working with welders while perched on a ladder, holding a beam in place as it was being welded to a wall or ceiling. Averting your eyes away from the torch's flash while being burnt by its sparks without grimacing was expected and earned man points from your fellow shipyard workers. As the summer elapsed and my time with these men was expiring, I understood that I desperately wanted and needed their approval. They had become my work family, and a bond was quickly established. Unlike me, these men would not be leaving at summer's end. Their life was spent working in the bellies of ship to support those they loved. They were a group I came to admire and respect. At the end of August, I turned in my safety glasses, badge, and toolbox and walked out to shipyard gates for the last time. I left behind some great guys and lots of crazy memories. What I gained far outdistanced what was left behind. Walking down familiar streets of QuinZEE, I finally felt my place and stead were earned. My connection to the city was reestablished with a deeper understanding of those who came before it. The shipyard had served its purpose to a young man as it had done for many who came before me. It would meant him more like me until the gates closed permanently in 1980. A few weeks after my last day at the yard, I sat down again beside my father, and he asked a familiar question. So, what are you going to do now? There was a knowing look and wry smile on his face as he waited for my answer. And I understood that this question was entirely different than the one he posed before that summer. One word had been strategically added at the end: now. While I didn't have an answer, I quickly realized one wasn't needed. I certainly knew what I wasn't going to do. I smiled back at my dad and gave him an appreciative nod.
I'm sorry, I couldn't contain my laughter. I had to shut the microphone off because, as always, your words paint a wonderful picture. That's a great story.
It's a time I'll never forget.
Of course.
And I had a lot of friends who graduated with me who did the same as I did. And I think it was probably their dad's idea too. And actually, it was pretty good money for a young kid graduating high school. But I don't know many that spent a long time there after the initial summer they worked.
I think what your dad did sounds like something my father would have done if we were living in QuinZEE. He refers to those things as teachable moments. And
Yes.
your teachable moment lasted an entire summer, but it taught you a lot of things. First of all, it taught you, okay, you didn't want to do that. And it taught you to respect the value of hard work and all of these other things. I mean, that's what your story, while funny, it's not diminishing in any way. It's nothing but admiration and respect for the work that these guys were doing to put food on the table.
And I think it was. And it's when I came to realize that what I took for granted was my dad was working into shipyard. I had no idea what that encompassed,
Right.
no idea what that was about. And after that summer, I had a great appreciation for what he was doing to bring up us three kids.
Like you said at the very end. So what are you going to do now? Because he knew you weren't going back.
Yeah, he knew the answer was, well, Dad, I think I'll join you at the shipyard. He knew that wasn't coming. So it made me think, well, what am I going to do now? Right?
Let me ask this question for you, since you just said that. Do you think he would have wanted you to join him there?
No,
Okay.
I think he did that purposefully
Yeah.
in order to say, okay, here's what I don't want you to do without him saying it, but here's what I do. Now, what are you going to do now that you know what really hard work is all about? And it was, like you said, a wake-up call. It was just great memories. So I'll never, obviously, it's part of my stories, but I'll never forget it. It was, I think for lack of a better word, there was epiphany. It was an epiphany working there. A realization that a man needs to work. Some men have to work harder than others. And we all don't have choices sometimes, though we think we do. There are some times when circumstance takes over, family, obligations,
Yep.
and then we find ourselves in a job and we have to support our family, and we do.
I know how hard my folks worked. Your story reminds me of a bunch of things, totally different circumstances, but I remember what popped into my head when you were talking about how your father wanted to give you an experience in the hope that you didn't follow in his footsteps. My dad used to smoke when I was younger. And I can remember when I was a kid, at one point he said to me, John, if you ever want to learn how to smoke, come to me and I'll teach you how to smoke. And he said that when I was young. He quit. He struggled, but he eventually wound up quitting. Thankfully, he's still with us. He'll be 89 in August and all that
Oh,
kind of
great.
stuff. Yeah. I can remember him saying that a couple of times to me. And I remember I was like 10 years old and I latched onto it. And I started bugging him. Hey, say, Dad, you said you'd teach me how to smoke. Can you teach me how to smoke? And I had these visions of sitting in my bedroom by my desk doing my homework, and my little brothers looking at me thinking I was so cool because I was smoking cigarette.
Right.
I mean, I had these visions, you say, yeah, yeah, okay. And so looking back on it now, I mean, I know he was hoping he'd ignore it and I would drop it. I think he was hoping I would drop it, but I kept pestering him.
Yes.
And one day he said, okay. And so he came home with a pack of Camel cigarettes,
Of course.
which had no filter.
Right.
And he sat me down in a chair in the kitchen. He poured a big glass of water. He set it right next to me. And of course, he puts the cigarette in his mouth and he says, okay, I want you to put this in your mouth. And I'm going to strike the match. And my mother is looking at my father, terrified that
Right.
he's going to start smoking again, number one. And
Right.
number two, this 10-year-old punk is going to be getting a cigarette and thinking, hey, this is all that and more. So she's like, I don't know about this one, Dave.
Right.
Anyway, he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to strike the match. I'm going to touch the end. And then I want you to take a deep breath. I'm like, okay. So I'm all excited and I'm nervous and I'm thinking, oh, this is going to be awesome. And he strikes the match, touches the end of it. And I go, I mean, gasping. He says, no, no, no. Come on, keep going. And I got maybe a third of that cigarette and I was just dying. He says, have a glass of water and have some more of that cigarette. Anyway, teachable moment. He's like, are you sure you really want to take this up? And I said, yeah, I think I'm good. And so message received, sometimes it's the tough lesson.
Absolutely. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we all tried one time.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And thankfully, my result was much like yours. And my one thought afterward was, what the hell is wrong with people that are smoking these things?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, I can't say that I've never puffed on a cigar ever
Right.
since,
Right.
But yeah, no, I'm right there with you. Why? And the money. But, I did some hard work after I got out of college too. I paid for school by being a meat cutter. Excuse me.
Oh,
Yeah. My mom has an expression, and I'm sure you've written a story about it, but she has this expression. She says, no experience is ever wasted. And I'm sure there are things that you did during that summer that in some way in your day-to-day activities, you recall something that you learned and apply it to the current situation.
absolutely. And I think one of the things I got out of that summer was just, hey, you can do it. You can go into the really terrible situations. I'm sorry, some people might not agree with that, but in my estimation, and you can do it. And you've got that strength, that inner strength to do that. And I learned later one summer, and that's another story, and we'll do that another time, when I was with my mother, a summer I spent with her because I never lived with my mother except for that summer.
Oh,
I was working in a leather factory, and I would open the factory. It would be well over 100 degrees inside. I
wow.
had to turn down all the heat, and then I had to take the nails out of the board, the tacks they were called, from leather strips, and put them on. I'd get paid by how many I took off these boards and placed so the people could tan them. And that was another one of those jobs that was like, you know what? Whatever you have to do, you can do it, guy. We have more there if we only look.
There's a great book. I don't know if it's called Can't Hurt Me.
Ah,
And it's written by a retired Navy SEAL. Have you ever heard of a guy by the name of David Goggins?
I haven't, but I admire these people
Well,
They're amazing people.
I got to tell you, Patrick, if you want a good book or a good audio book, I highly recommend It Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins.
I'm
And
writing it down.
yeah, if you have, do you listen to audiobooks at all?
I haven't, but as you know, you and I have explored that idea
Right.
with doing that with my QuinZEE book, and I was thinking of perhaps joining one of those audio clubs.
Well, if you do, I would recommend you get the audio version of his book. And the reason I say that is that he is interviewed by the narrator of the book, and they co-wrote the book. And the guy who's narrating his book, it's kind of like an audiobook slash podcast where the guy will read a chapter from the book and then turn to David, who wrote the book, and say, wow, man. And then they do a deep dive, kind of like what you and I do, where you read a chapter of your book and then you and I discuss it. This type of thing that we're doing is the exact same thing that he's done with his audiobook. But this guy grew up in an abusive family. His father was horrible. And he wound up weighing like 300 pounds or so. He's like 6'3" or something, giant of a guy. And he's open about it. And he shows a picture of himself when he was this massive 300 and some odd pound dude. And he talks about how he came home from his job spraying for cockroaches at different restaurants, and came home and turned on the Discovery Channel and watched this program about Navy SEALs. And he said, I want to do that. So he went to a recruiting office, and there was a way for him to get in there, but he needed to lose like 100 pounds
Wow.
3 months in order to be able to qualify to get into the applying process.
Right.
And he talks about how he did it. He just flipped a switch. And he talks about this thing, what you talk about, you can get through this, like you have this reservoir of experience that you can draw on. He calls it the cookie jar. And he says, whenever I doubt my ability to finish, I have this cookie jar of past things that I've done where I've had to dig deep and pull something out of there and reflect on the fact like, hey, look what you did before.
What a great idea.
Yeah. It's
That's
a great
awesome.
book. It's a great book.
I'm getting it.
Yeah.
You convinced me. Absolutely.
Yeah, and if you don't get the audiobook, definitely get the paperback or take it out of the library or whatever. But I mean, it's about, you talk about hard work. I think that's why so many people, this is John Melley talking right now. This is just him speculating, me speculating. But I think a lot of people, we've searched for comfort in making things easier so much that I think, it kind of goes against human nature. I've often said this to people, particularly since I have that experience as a meat cutter. I don't want to turn this into all about me, but I think, the meat cutters that I worked with, they had a real respect for the food that they ate because they looked at it from the perspective of it's not just a piece of meat on a styrofoam tray with plastic wrap over it. It was actually a living animal that we took its life so that we could sustain ourselves. And, it wasn't that long ago that people had to be hunting and growing their own food. And so that took work. And most of the time they spent providing for their own sustenance in one way or another. And I think a lot of the problems that people are having is that we've kind of convenienced ourselves so far away from who we really are as humans and our human nature that there's this disconnect. And I think that manifests itself in many ways where we started talking about at the very beginning of this episode is like, we need to talk with one another more. We need more human connection. The technology is great because look at what we're doing here. You're in Colorado, I'm here in QuinZEE, and we're recording this. And that aspect of it is amazing, but it can also be very isolating. So I think that's two sides of the same coin, right?
I think what you said is so important. And it comes down to, again, I know we've talked about this before, but you can't say it enough. And again, no matter what side of this political insanity that you are on that's going through our country, we all of us, all Americans, have so much more in common than we do apart. And the social media and the different things that are trying so hard to separate us, we have to fight against that. And we have to realize we are all humans. We all should respect one another and care about one another and listen, emphatically listen with empathy to each other. I hope we can start doing that.
I think there's a real hunger from a lot of people. I think and the ones who aren't hungry are the ones profiting, like you said, on both sides,
Mm-hmm.
keeping people divided. I remember I had put out an episode. I don't remember what it was, but somebody had listened to the episode and reached out to me and said, "Have you ever thought of doing a political podcast?" And I said, "You know, that's not what this is about. If it's politics in a historical context, given that we're the city of presidents, sure, but."
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to be interviewing candidates for different office. So I'll just put that out right now. This isn't that. This is not about
Right.
politics. There are plenty of outlets and platforms to get that. This
Mm-hmm.
is about your stories and business owners and history and fun stuff that's going on around QuinZEE. So, at any rate, so just
All my stories are about all of us.
exactly, yeah,
Right?
yeah.
What we all have in common, we all share these things, okay? And if we connect with those, maybe we can start connecting again with each other. I hope
Yeah.
so.
I think that's great. Speaking of stories, I heard a rumor that you are actually getting close to finishing up your second book. Is that correct?
John, it's with I'm not sure what type of heart I'm going to say here, not a heavy heart, because I'm not a writer. I don't write easily. I admire people that can write book after book and put plots together and do all these things. And all of a sudden they have 50 books they've written. And I'm just in awe of them. I bow. I tell them, you are just amazing. That's not me. For me to write, and I'm more of a short story writer, but yes, I did. I wrote one more book at the behest of my old English teacher, Thomas Hall,
Oh,
who was
that's
my
cool.
track coach, and he read my book growing up. QuinZEE, he was my English teacher also. And he read my book. He liked it. And he said, Pat, I want you to write a character-based novel. And as soon as he wrote that to me and I read it, John, I said, no way. There's no way. I'm done. I checked my little box. That's the only little box I wanted to check. I wrote a book, right?
Yeah.
But sure enough, it's like an old teacher who you admired who gave you another homework assignment.
That's what I was thinking about. I was like, here's this guy. He reaches out to you and says, "Okay, now
Yeah, exactly.
let's raise the bar a little higher, Patrick."
Yes. It's, I think I told him something along the lines of, I'll think about it. And I did, unfortunately. And I kept thinking about it until one day, having no idea what I was going to write about, I was able to put together what's called a short novel. It's only going to be probably 80 pages. And it involves two people who meet unexpectedly in a very unexpected place. And then a conversation ensues. And there's backstories through that conversation. And then the book is called A Leaf, which people might say, what the heck is that about?
A
And
leaf.
a leaf, Leaf,
Okay.
that falls from a tree. And this leaf keeps making unexpected appearances at various times. So I guess that's basically what this book is going to be about.
That's really cool. So, how close are you to finishing it?
I'm just now working with this person who's helped me do some edits to it. And I would say within the next month,
Oh,
it should be out.
very
Yes.
cool.
Yes. So I
Well,
guess I have two check boxes. As long as nobody else tells me I'm not writing another book. Thank you.
no, well, you never know. Never say never, they say, right?
That's what people keep telling me. Never say never. I'm like,
Well,
oh boy.
I mean, if you have fun with it, you know what I think is really cool? and I hope you take this the right way, it's like you're constantly challenging yourself. And I think that's what makes life interesting and worth doing. I'm going to be gross and self-promote myself. I actually wrote a book too.
Wow.
Yeah.
The voiceover athlete by John Melley.
Yep.
Nice.
Thanks, man. I'm going to have to.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I've had this thing. I've got a box of them here, and they've been sitting in my office since like late August. And I've started working on the marketing. What they don't tell you when you write something is that the marketing actually takes up more effort and time than actually writing the book. I don't know. I hope not, because it took me a long time to finally pull the trigger and getting this thing put together in a physical representation of it. But yeah, I'm going to have to send a copy to you.
That would be great.
So off air here, I'll have to get your mailing address and send one to you. Patrick, thanks again for sharing your story and telling us about your upcoming story. Before we started this episode, we were talking about, you had two stories you were going to choose from. I think we picked the right one. Not that the other one isn't any good, but I hope we'll do it a little down the road when the weather's a little warmer.
And I think people will like it, John.
I'm sure they will.
We all had our first car.
Oh, yes.
Yes. and we all have stories about our first car. And this is my short story about mine, which I'm sure will ring familiar with many of us.
I'll be honest, you gave me a little overview of it, and I've obviously read it in your book as well. And I think a lot of people are going to be able to relate to it. But Patrick, anything else you want to say before we say goodbye to our listeners?
No, except one final time is everybody who's listening, let's all start talking again. Let's all start meeting at coffee shops or bookstores or wherever. Let's say hi to each other. Let's be humans again. Let's not worry so much so it's hard about what's happening outside. And let's at least begin to communicate with each other. And then the other, I think, will take care of naturally.
Sounds good, man.
Okay.
All right, Patrick. Thanks again for being on the show.
You betcha. Thank you, John.
Well, that's it for this episode of the All About QuinZEE podcast. I want to thank you for listening. Check out the All About QuinZEE podcast on Instagram. That's a great way for you to connect with us. We are at All About QuinZEE podcast on Instagram. When you do, you're going to get an opportunity to sign up for our weekly QuinZEE Happenings e-newsletter. Every week, it's going to give you a handful of great events happening around QuinZEE so you can plan your schedules and make plans for the weekend or whatever, happening all around the city. So go there, get it for free. Just click the link at All About QuinZEE Podcast on Instagram, or you can sign up at allaboutquinzeepodcast.com. And remember, if you've got a great event coming up or you have a great guest that you think should be on the show, we want to know. Reach out to us at allaboutquinzeepodcast.com or send me a message through Instagram. We'll be back next week with more fun. In the meantime, thanks for listening.